quickly introduce Lindsay Wallstrom-Edwards. She is the head of partnerships at Antidote Technologies. We have a partnership with Antidote Technologies. If you look at our clinical trials page, we have the clinical trial matching tool. That's exactly what they develop and work with. So Lindsay, we want to thank you for being here today. And would you like to further introduce yourself, and then we can get started?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to meet everyone. I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen because I have some slides to share with you today, since this is a more complex topic. So again, the name of today's session is Clinical Trials 101, Understanding How Clinical Trials Work to Find the Right Fit for You. As Jerry said, I'm Lindsay Wallstrom-Edwards. I'm the head of partnerships for the organization. I've been with Antidote for about 3.5 years. Prior to this, I worked in research myself and also at some nonprofit organizations in communications work there. So my primary role with the organization is to work with organizations like Myositis Support and Understanding to help make it easier for people to find and connect with medical research. Antidote itself is a digital health company. Our aim is to accelerate the development of new potential treatments by closing the gap between medical research and the people who need it or who are looking for it. We do this in a couple of different ways, and I'll speak to the way that we're working with Myositis Support and Understanding later today. So I'm going to dive right in, and I think Jerry said that there will be some time for questions and answers at the end. I don't know if you have questions as you think of them, if you want to put them in chat. Otherwise, we'll open up the floor and have you ask them directly after the discussion. So let's start with the basics. What is medical research? Medical research or clinical research is research in which people or data or samples of tissues are studied to understand health and disease. It helps us find new and better ways to detect, diagnose, treat, and prevent disease. And that's straight from the National Cancer Institute, but it really does apply across the board. I wanted to speak briefly because it's important, especially when we talk about rare disease trials, in trials for more rare diseases, about the different kinds of research that you might see. So basically, research falls into two categories. You have observational trials and experimental trials. You might hear the word intervention. That is also often included in the description. So observational trials are trials where we're really looking at changes in conditions or changes in people's health over time. So you have probably heard of like the Nurses' Health Study. It's often cited when we say things like alcohol is associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. So that's a cohort study, and it's a group out of Harvard who follows nurses, their health over time. They ask questionnaires, they do some labs, and they see how people change and how their health status changes based on what they're eating and being exposed to in their environment. That's called a prospective study. So what that means is that people join the trial at a specific time, and we look at changes in health over time, moving forward into the future. There's also something that's used a lot in an observational sense for rare diseases, which is called a case control study. And that's when we're trying to understand a new disease or how something works. So the way that a case control study operates, it's retrospective usually, which means that we're actually looking backwards. And we find, a researcher will find a case or someone who has the condition, and then a control, which is someone who has a really similar background, usually the same gender, age, they live in the same city, they've had the same kinds of work histories, et cetera, over time, who doesn't have the condition. And then we look to see what are the differences and what might have led to the one person developing a specific type of cancer or a different condition, and why the other person didn't. And something else in rare conditions that we see a lot are things called case studies. That's really looking at one person or group of people's health over time to understand how someone living with a condition experiences that condition. This is used a lot in diseases like lupus, where the disease can show up really differently for all sorts of people, right? So it's not like there's two cases that are identical. Everyone kind of has their own experience with the condition. So a case study would be an appropriate design in that sense. And then what you hear a lot when you hear about new drug trials or devices, that's usually done through a randomized controlled trial, sometimes shortened to an RCT. Again, that's prospective, which means forward-looking. We get a bunch of people into the trial at the start and we see how their health changes over time. And that's the reason that we do drug and device trials as randomized control trials, and I'll explain more about this in moving forward, is that it allows us to make sure that any changes we see from that treatment are actually a cause of and related to that new device or drug. So we make sure that we're not seeing changes or improvements in health that weren't actually there. And that's related to the approvals process for new treatments. I wanted to touch briefly on what's happening right now in myositis research. There are currently 56 trials that are recruiting or not yet recruiting, so they'll be looking for volunteers shortly, that are listed on clinicaltrials.gov, which is the registry that we use to power our tool. It has most of the trials in the United States, but also some international trials as well. And they're looking for 21,660 volunteers for those trials. Of the trials that are listed, 38 are intervention. So 25 are looking at a new drug or device. There are some behavioral intervention trials in there as well. So what that means is that they're testing a new drug or device, or maybe a new diet or movement program. And then 18 trials are observational, which means that researchers are really trying to understand more about the condition and changes over time.
Lindsay,
yeah.
would that be like one of those natural history trials?
Yeah, that's like a case study is sometimes a natural history trial, or an observational trial could be a natural history. It's really understanding, natural history trials are trying to understand how people who are living with the condition, how they experience that condition over time, and how that condition might have come about. So that's usually an observational, I mean, it's always an observational trial, but it's not necessarily testing an intervention. It's more about understanding the condition.
Okay, thank you.
And that's why we see more of those in rare disease, for rare diseases, because we don't always understand as much about them as we would for something like heart disease, which affects a lot of people. And because rare diseases sometimes show up differently or have slight variations in how they present, we want to understand as much as we can about a disease as we're developing new potential treatments and thinking about ways that we could potentially treat or cure a condition.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So when we look at research, there are some terms that you probably will hear thrown about. So I just wanted to define them pretty quickly. A protocol is a document that outlines what a trial aims to study, how it plans to do that, and what indicators the researchers will be looking at to see if they've been successful in achieving the aims that they put out at the beginning. So that includes the inclusion and exclusion criteria for a trial. And I'm going to obviously touch on that in just a few bullets, in a few more bullets, sorry, and some information about the drug or the device that's being studied. And it also explains more about how the study will be conducted, things like number of site visits, types of procedures that will be involved, etc. The principal investigator, sometimes called the PI, is the lead researcher on the trial. This person is ultimately responsible for how a study is conducted. You may partake in a trial and never meet the PI or never interact with this individual, but rest assured that this is the person who is responsible for overseeing the work of whomever you're interacting with. An institutional review board, is sometimes called an IRB or an ethics committee, is a group of individuals from the community. So it includes researchers, but also members of the community at large. And these people are responsible for ensuring that a trial protects all of the patients who participate in that trial. So among other things, the IRB reviews all marketing materials to make sure that any outreach that's done and any communication to people who are interested in volunteering for the trial doesn't oversell what the trial might accomplish, and that it clearly states the risks and benefits to participating. Speaking of risks and benefits to participating, the informed consent process is a process that every trial has to have at the beginning. And what it means is it's a process where a potential trial participant learns about the risks and benefits of participating. They're able to ask questions and make sure that they understand all of the information that's presented to them before they sign an informed consent document. So when you are screening for a trial, this is one of the first things that you'll do. You'll have a conversation with the study coordinator, and you, during that conversation, get to ask as many questions as you have about the trial. And I'll touch later in the discussion on some of the questions that we recommend asking, but there will be others that are specific to you that you should consider asking as well. And then once you feel comfortable and are still interested in partaking, you'll sign this document and officially begin the screening process. So that is an informed consent document. It's sometimes called an ICF or an informed consent form. Study phases, they tell us about where in the drug approval process with the FDA, where it is in that process. So a phase 1 trial is just starting out. Researchers are usually testing the drug in a small number of healthy volunteers to make sure that it is safe and that it's working as they anticipated. And then in a phase 3 trial, researchers are testing medication in a larger number of volunteers to confirm that it's working. Phase 2 trials, which is the step in between, you know that the drug is safe, but you want to make sure that it's working as you anticipate it to be working. That's often where rare disease trials will end because you'll have a smaller number of volunteers, and then it'll go through something called an expedited review, which means that a company is able to submit the paperwork in faster. They don't necessarily need to go through a phase 3 trial because they will have had a larger proportion of people who are impacted by the condition in that phase 2 trial, just given the nature of the disease. And then I also wanted just to touch on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's a little self-explanatory, but a key thing here to understand is that the inclusion and exclusion criteria for trial, which it means the characteristics that someone has to have or can't have in order to partake in the trial, are really set out to make sure that the study, at the end of the trial, the researchers are able to say, these are the changes and the differences we saw between people who received the treatment and those who didn't, and we're confident that these differences are resulting from the condition. So a lot of times people feel really upset if they don't qualify for a trial because they had one of the exclusion criteria, or maybe they didn't meet all the inclusion criteria. It's really nothing personal. It's more about how the study is designed, and there might be some other ways to gain access to that treatment, which I'll touch on later in the presentation. And then finally, an important term to know is blinding. So again, with that randomized control trial design, when you apply to partake in the trial, you don't know whether you're going to be receiving the experimental treatment or not receiving that experimental treatment. And that's called blinding. And sometimes researchers also don't know whether or not you're receiving the treatment or not receiving the treatment. And that's to make sure that any changes that are seen and that are noted in the results are actually resulting from that drug or device. So I know a lot of information. I'll share these slides with Jerry afterwards. There's some good links on some of the slides that should give you some information about where you can read more and learn a little bit more. I did want to include a couple of notes about rare disease trials specifically. So as I mentioned, there's usually a smaller sample size requirement, which can lead to the study and the drug being approved after a phase 2 trial. It won't necessarily have to go through a phase 3. It's less likely to be a true randomized control trial. People are more likely to receive the new drug. That's that fourth bullet where it says the new drug or device. An active comparator is a term that you might hear. People are more likely to receive that new treatment, especially if there isn't another one available at the time. They're less likely to be double-blinded, so you may not know whether or not you're receiving the new drug or device. Well, you would know if you got a device. You might not know if you're receiving the new drug, but the researcher likely would know that. And then I wanted to talk briefly about orphan drugs. That's a term that you might hear that's really relevant only to rare disease trials. And what it is there's an office at the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, that provides incentives for industry to develop new treatments for rare diseases, and those fall under the category orphan drugs. And the incentives might be things like grants to develop the products, tax credits for researching treatments for these conditions, vouchers for priority review of other conditions that the drug or device might be useful for, some assistance in writing the documents that are necessary to file for approval, and then market exclusivity for a set period of time if and when the drug is approved. So that was a lot of information. I'm going to go into the fun part now.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
For those of you that are here with inclusion body myositis, if you want to think about the arimoclomol trial while she's talking about this, because a lot of you know about that trial, it is a double-blinded study. The arimoclomol trial is. So when she's saying double-blinded, the doctor nor you, nobody knows who's taking what, whether or not you're going to be on the drug or the placebo. So that's just maybe a comparison to help kind of understand as you go along.
That's a really good example. Thank you for that. So one of the things that I hear a lot is that people think medical research is great, but they don't want to partake in it themselves. And research shows that this is the general attitude of most people, especially in the United States. We have pretty low medical research participation relative to other countries. But there are some reasons why you should care. So the bottom line is that without volunteers who are willing to partake in research, there truly can be no treatments or cures. And 80% of medical research is delayed or canceled due to difficulty enrolling participants in the trials. There are a few other reasons that you might want to partake. So one is access to care. Often research studies are done with some of the leading experts in the condition, so you might be able to have access to care by those physicians. The quality of care is usually very good because you are being watched really, really carefully while you're partaking in a medical research trial. You're helping to advance science. So some conditions are genetic, and that can be a really big motivator for people to partake in research. But also just generally giving back is actually the number one driver for motivator for people to participate in research, is they want to give back to other members of their community. And then sometimes there are some financial benefits. These are more common in a phase 1 trial, but even in a phase 2 or phase 3, participants are usually compensated for time and travel. So that can be an incentive for some people to partake in the research. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but there are a lot of objections that we hear. One is, I don't want to get a placebo. I don't want a sugar pill. Not all trials do use a placebo, and as I mentioned, that's rare disease trials are often less likely to use a placebo, or they have a smaller number of people who are receiving the placebo. And even if a placebo is used, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't receive any treatment. So when a treatment is available for a condition, it's called the standard of care. When you're in a clinical trial, at a minimum, you need to be receiving the standard of care. So for example, if you were partaking in a cancer clinical trial, you would be receiving chemo and radiation as applicable. You wouldn't be left with no treatment options at all. And you can ask any researcher what's going to be happening in that particular trial. Time is another big consideration. There is definitely a time commitment involved to partaking in research. There are some new initiatives underway to make it easier and less burdensome. So things like virtual trials, or actually having doctors or lab technicians come to people's houses to do blood draws or do some of the lab values. This is becoming increasingly common. So you might want to consider, if time's a concern, you might want to consider a trial that has some of those opportunities available. You might, switching physicians is a big one, especially with rare disease. This might not happen because there are fewer people who are working in the condition in general, so they might be more likely to participate in research. But even if you do love your physician, they aren't the one that's conducting the trial, talk to the research coordinator and to your physician. It might be possible for you to stay under the care of your physician and just receive some of the clinical trial services from the other providers. If you don't do well with uncertainty and you don't want to be a guinea pig, we touched on this a little bit. We like to think of clinical trial participants as test pilots rather than guinea pigs. And it's important to note, too, that a lot of work is done before human trials ever start. So even before a phase 1 trial happens, there's been a lot of testing done in laboratories to make sure that the treatment is safe and effective. And if you're really concerned, you could look for a later phase trial, phase 2, phase 3, or even you might hear something called a real world evidence trial. And that's after a treatment has been released. Researchers will still track how people are responding to that treatment. So that might be a way for you to give back as well. If you are concerned about doctors or a little unsure about how safe you feel partaking in medical research, Tuskegee is a word that's thrown out a lot. I will be upfront. There were some unethical things that happened in the not so distant past, but as a result of those, a lot of protections went into place and regulations went into place, and medical research is a very, very heavily regulated industry, and IRBs are in place as a result of those past experiences. So if you have concerns about this, we do have some resources I can share, but do rest assured that there are individuals who are looking out for your best interest in overseeing the study, and you would have access to those contacts while you're in the trial, so you could ever, if you ever had a concern, you could reach out. If you're worried about bad side effects from the new treatment, as I mentioned, you're monitored really closely when you partake in medical research. So you would report any of those side effects. The researchers would be watching it carefully. You can leave a trial for any reason at any time. So if you really didn't like the way you were feeling or the way that the doctors are responding to you, you could potentially leave that. You could leave the trial. But again, you're going to receive care, and the researchers are going to do everything they can to make sure that you're getting the care and the attention that you need, and that they're addressing any concerns that come up during the course of that trial. Finding the right trial, I'll talk to that one in a minute. I'll show you exactly how you can find a trial on the Myositis Support and Understanding website. If you're concerned about things like not being paid to participate, or you're afraid of needles, MRIs, or doctors, make sure that you're looking for a trial that's a good fit for you. 58 trials is not a small number of trials, so there are lots of opportunities available. You could consider an observational trial, you could consider a natural history of disease trial, and really partake in research and give back that way. If you don't have transportation, increasingly, and especially for rare disease trials, researchers are, and industry is often willing to compensate for travel. So they'll pay for like a Lyft or an Uber or a taxi. Sometimes they'll provide gas money if that's a concern. Sometimes flights are even covered and reimbursable. So definitely ask the site the site staff for any research trial that you're interested in partaking in. Trials are also for all stages of disease. It's not just an option for people who have exhausted all other treatment options. So consider joining a trial at any point. And then I already mentioned this, but you can leave a trial at any time for any reason. So even if you sign an informed consent document and decide the next day you don't want to partake anymore, that's absolutely fine. You can leave the trial. So the biggest one we hear is, what if it doesn't work? And I like to flip that and say, but what if it does? We talk a lot about how tomorrow's treatments are in clinical trials today. So the best way to get access to the next generation of treatments is to partake in a clinical trial. So I know there's some questions coming in. Jerry, is there anything that I should be addressing now, or should we wait till I have a couple more slides to go?
There are actually not questions at all. So
okay.
Yep, good.
Great. So the next thing I wanted just to cover is how to find a clinical trial. This is the Antidote clinical trial search tool. You can see where to find it on the understandingmyositis.org website. So it's understandingmyositis.org/clinical-trials. And if you click on the start button, what we'll do is we'll ask you a few questions about you and your health, and it's going to help narrow down the list of potential trial opportunities that are available to you. I mentioned at the top of the discussion that our search tool includes trials that are open and looking for volunteers on clinicaltrials.gov. And there is an opportunity, if you want, to leave an email address for something called a trial alert. What a trial alert does is it allows us to notify you when new potential trial matches are added to clinicaltrials.gov, so that you don't have to keep going back and searching every month. You're welcome to do that if that's of interest to you. But if you do decide to register for a trial alert, we will notify you when new matches are added to the system. So when you're thinking about finding a trial, I've touched on a lot of these over the course of the conversation today, but really think about the kind of trial you're interested in and what you could commit to. If you have time constraints, if you have concerns about the types of treatments, or location or anything like that, make sure that you find a trial that's a good fit for you. And that includes the phase of the trial. So if you're not really interested in testing out a new treatment, again, observational trials are a great opportunity, or you might want to consider a phase 2 trial, or even phase 2 trials, there are different subsections. So like a phase 2B is a later stage trial. So that might be a good fit for you. You want to ask a question of yourself. And then also, if you decide to apply for a trial, ask this of the researchers too. If the study drug will be available after the trial concludes. Sometimes individuals are able to continue taking that medication while the drug's going through the approval process, especially if they have responded really well. So again, make sure that you ask that question if that might be of interest to you. And if that's not going to be an opportunity that's available, before you decide to join a trial, make sure that you would feel comfortable if you found something that was working really well for you, and then you were going to have to stop taking it for a while, make sure that would be okay with you. I actually know someone from one of our lupus partners who helped to get a drug approved, had to stop taking it for a while, and is now back on it and responding really well. So she helped to get it to where it needed to be, but she did have to take a break in taking that drug for a while. And for her, that was okay. But for some people, that might not be something that you're comfortable with. We talked a little bit about being reimbursed for time and travel. If that is something that you need, make sure that you ask that question of the researchers. Also, when you search for trials on our site, some of the researchers have provided that information. So you might be able to see it on the trial page there. But if it's not there, make sure to ask the researcher during the application process. And then think about the kind of information that you want to receive during and after a trial. This is more of a gut check. If you're speaking with the researcher and they're not as forthcoming with information, you don't feel like you don't think that the communication style is going to work for you, that's really important to know. You are a stakeholder in the research trial, and you should be treated like a stakeholder would be treated. And so you have a right to ask for that information and to make sure that you're being communicated with in a way that feels right to you. So it's kind of like when you hire, I always say this, when you're hiring someone for an organization, at the end of the day, when you get to your top candidates, everyone's equally qualified, and it kind of comes down to personality. That's a little bit the case with clinical trials too. If there is a trial that you really want to partake in, make sure that the research site that you're working with is a good site for you to be involved with, both in terms of location, but also in terms of study staff. And if there is, like I said, like a specific trial you're looking for, if you go to one site and it's just not working for you, if another site is an option, maybe consider talking to that site or to another researcher at the site, other than the one that you've initially spoken with, because you need to feel comfortable during this process as well. So you found a trial, and then what happens? What's next? So things to expect before you actually get started is to have a conversation with the researcher of the trial. It could be the PI, maybe the study coordinator, especially if there are lots of different research sites, and a research site could be a hospital or a clinic, and some medical facility. So you would have different coordinators at each of those sites. You'll have a conversation with them, likely over the phone. You'll probably come in for an in-person screening visit. They may ask to see your medical records in advance of that visit, or maybe after that visit. So they might ask you to sign a medical records release form as well during one of those first 2 steps. You'll sign the informed consent document, which we talked about. And then there's sometimes called a study run-in period, which is a period of time when people are, researchers are double checking labs, and maybe you're keeping a symptoms journal or some type of behavior journal or food journal. They are double checking the information to make sure that the trial is going to be a good fit for you. And if at the end of that run-in period, if you're still interested, and the trial does appear to be a good fit based on the information that they've collected during that run-in period, you'll randomize into the trial. So you'll, again, be randomly assigned to either receive the new treatment or to not receive that new treatment. And that's where the word randomization comes from, is you're randomly assigned to one of those 2 groups. Or you might screen fail. And what a screen fail means is that you, during that run-in period, something was uncovered in the lab values or in the symptoms journal that made you not completely eligible for that trial. But don't lose heart. There could be another opportunity out there for you. So if you do screen fail for a trial, it's not the end. Stay in touch with the researcher. They might know of other trials, or consider applying for another trial through the tool on the Myositis site, or directly in discussions with your physician, who might be able to connect with research as well. And then during the trial, you're going to continue to visit with the study site. So you'll make multiple visits, likely to that research site, where you'll speak with a doctor or a nurse who's coordinating the study. It's going to be pretty similar to your usual doctor's visit, but probably a lot more questions, and you'll spend a lot more time with the researcher than you maybe would with your doctor normally. It will likely involve some lab work, especially if you're considering participating in a drug or a device trial. And you might be speaking with several people at that research site. So it might not just be one appointment that you're looking at. You might be speaking with multiple people at the site. Between study visits, you may receive check-in calls or emails from the research site to see how things are going. You may be asked, depending on how the study is designed and what they're testing, you might be asked to keep a diary or a log of symptoms, food, behaviors. It depends a bit on how the trial is structured, but that's also a good question to ask when you're applying for trials, what's going to be expected in terms of the between study visit time. And then after the trial concludes, again, you may be able to continue taking the medication. So that's something that you can ask at the start. And we encourage everyone to ask to receive the study results and the details of what happens. With a high profile trial, you'll likely see it advertised in newspapers or publications. But regardless of the trial that you partake in, you have a right to see those results, and you should definitely ask to see a copy of them. And then I did want to touch a little bit on this topic. So you didn't find a trial, or you weren't eligible. Now what? And there are two things we talk a lot about in the United States: expanded access and right to try. Expanded access is probably more relevant to our discussion, but what it is it allows individuals who are not eligible for a clinical trial, they don't meet those narrow eligibility criteria for a specific trial, to gain access to that treatment. And it does require support from the FDA, your physician, and the drug company. So it is a lengthy process. There's a lot of paperwork involved with it. But if this is something that's really interesting to you, you should speak with your physician, because they're the ones that actually have to initiate that request to have access to the expanded access program. But that's something to consider if you're not eligible for a specific trial, but just by a couple of those inclusion-exclusion criteria, but that the treatment might actually be a good fit for you. And then right to try, I included it because there was a lot of conversation about this. This happened a couple of years ago. It's a pathway through which terminally ill individuals can gain access to a treatment that hasn't gone through the full approvals process yet. So their drugs are eligible once they've completed phase 1 trial, which is, again, with the healthy volunteers, to make sure that there are no really risky side effects for any specific drug. And this one is a little bit harder to gain access to. It's maybe not as relevant in this situation, but I did just want to touch on it. That right to try is more, it's harder to qualify for. Not that expanded access is incredibly easy either, but your physician should know how to trigger this request for expanded access. Right to try is a little bit more narrow in its application, and there are some more stringent side effects. Not side effects. There are more stringent requirements on that. Okay, so I did want to open it up to Q&A. I know I covered a lot of information, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And again, I'll share these slides with Jerry afterwards so that he can share them out to anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Lindsay. So who has questions?
I know some individuals who were upset that they were not chosen for a recent trial. They were on a waiting list. There was a very long waiting list. And it seems like there may be reasons why some people are chosen and some people are not. Are there ways to increase your chances for being chosen?
So I don't know the specifics of the example that you're speaking to. There are, again, the eligibility criteria. So those can feel really narrow at times. And that's usually a source of upset for people where they say like, oh, I missed this one lab value by 0.1. Why wasn't I accepted into the trial? And that can feel really frustrating. Those criteria are put in the protocol, and it's hard for researchers to make exceptions to that once they are outlined there. One of the things that we are pushing for a lot is to involve people in the design process of the study, so that patients have a voice in what that looks like from the start. So that's one way to get involved. I can't speak to a way specifically to increase the likelihood of taking part in a trial, other than to say, be proactive in reaching out to the researchers, the sites. Sometimes sites aren't always great at getting back to people. So, being that person who's on the phone every day saying like, hey, what's the status? And from your reaction, I'm guessing that's what happened and that you were doing that.
Well, I think I was the squeakiest wheel in all of myositis land.
Yeah.
And it paid off for me, for people who have never made contact with what is going to be a clinical test site, mm-hmm. or a doctor, or they're not seeing someone on the TMA board, or they don't have even remote proximity
right
to a test site. I think those are all factors myself. And I think if you're a known quantity and your doctor knows, or the investigator knows, you'll show up, you'll do what is required. It's not an extraordinary heavy lift, but it's a lift to do these things. So
yeah, it is. It's not
for patients to get out of the house, especially with a disabling condition, mm-hmm. like IBM. Just getting out of the house is a task in itself.
Right.
So I understand the concern.
Yeah. If somebody doesn't think they really can't face a 4-hour drive or a plane flight, or think about those things. And I think the investigative team thinks about that as well.
Yeah, those all go into factors. When we are helping researchers find people for specific trials, which is some of the work that we do. It's not the work we do with understanding with myositis support and understanding, but we do that work. Often we're given a certain radius that we should be finding people who live within that radius from the site. And it's specifically for the reason that you said, that it'll be easier for people to get in and get there. We do see an exception for that with rare disease trials. So often there is not necessarily a specific, like if with heart disease, you can say, I'm looking for people who live within 50 miles of Houston, and it's going to be really easy to find individuals who meet that. That's not necessarily the case for a rare disease. So people are often willing to travel more, but it can be, there can also be a disconnect between the industry group that's testing the new drug and the research sites who are doing the actual testing, where the company will say, I will pay for plane tickets. I don't care where people are coming from. If you're the right fit for this trial, I'll help you get there. And the research sites might be more focused on people who live within a certain geographical area from their research site. So we see that sometimes that sites are not always responsive. And when we do help with finding people for specific trials, we actually have a team of people who are on top of the sites and saying, like, you haven't called this person, they've been waiting 2 days to hear from you. Why haven't you reached out to them? And that's something that we do specifically because the type of feedback that you've shared, unfortunately, that is something that we see, but we are doing what we can, at least on the stuff that we work on, to help alleviate some of that. But, my very lengthy answer can be summarized as follow up. And I know it can be scary and you have a million things to do and you're not feeling great, which makes it more complicated, but making sure that you're being communicated with and people are getting back to you is the best way to ensure that you're going to get into that trial if you do meet those eligibility criteria.
I've got a question. How like a lot of your trials are over in America and all that. How do we access something like that over in Australia?
That is a great, yeah, that's a great question. There is the expanded access program is often a key for people who are living internationally. So there's a group that I spoke with just last week, actually. They're called My Tomorrows, MYTO. I can put it in the chat box if that would help, but My Tomorrows, just like tomorrow of the day.com. And they help people who are living outside of the US to access drugs that are in trials in the United States. So that would be a good resource if you're living internationally, which it sounds like you are. And the other way to do that, I just pulled this up. I can find the link and I can share it with Jerry, but there is a way to be considered for a visa specifically to partake in a medical research trial. So if there's something you're interested in partaking in the United States, there might be an option to participate through the National Institutes of Health.
Okay, yeah, because my specialist is in Perth, and she's supposed to be the top IBM person over here, but we don't seem to be getting access to trials, so it makes it very hard. I'm there willing to be a guinea pig, but if there's nothing there, I can't do it.
Yeah, no, that's expanded access might be an interesting route to go, and that's pretty common, especially in Europe and Australia, when there aren't research sites for drugs that are in trials in the United States.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy, thanks. That was a great question.
Yeah,
and thanks, Lindsay, for your answer. Richard asks, will you be excluded from a new trial if you've participated in one earlier?
Sometimes. It depends. So you might see a criteria listed called a washout period, which is a period of time that researchers want you to kind of like a break between treatments, and especially if it's testing a new drug or device. So, well, not device necessarily, but a new drug, that there will be a washout period. They want to make sure that former medication is out of your system. Sometimes you just can't have partaken in a trial at all prior to it. So I would look at the study inclusion and exclusion criteria. It'll state that pretty clearly there, whether or not that is something that would exclude you from participating in a trial. But that's not always the case. And I know quite a few people who have participated in multiple trials. Maybe they'll do an observational trial and then a case study and then a drug trial, and then they do another observational trial. So there are different ways to participate, even if you have participated in a trial before.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. Lindsay, do you have any final advice or comments that you want to impart upon us?
Oh, man. No, I think I spoke enough to put you all to sleep. I'm surprised you're still awake and with us. But I will share out the information, and I'll find that link, the link for the information on how to get how you might be able to apply for a visa for the clinical trial participation. And I'll make sure that Jerry has that to share out with everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. We appreciate your valuable time. And thank you for all the information. And we'll look forward to getting that and sharing with everybody.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys. You all have a great day.
Thank you.